All right, let's just dive right into this. Welcome to today's Explainer, where we're taking a journey to uncover the true, incredibly complex, and honestly pretty tragic origins of a man who is often hidden behind his own legend. We all know the name Malcolm X, right? But that iconic image we see printed on t-shirts and postage stamps, that's just a tiny fraction of the real story. Today, we're going to peel back the layers to see exactly how a absolutely shattered childhood gave birth to an absolute master of self-invention. But, to really understand the myth, we actually have to start at the dramatic end of his life. I want you to picture this suspenseful, ticking clock scene. It's a winter afternoon in 1965, up in Harlem at the Audubon Ballroom. At 1:45 p.m., a known opponent of Malcolm's walks right into the ballroom, completely unsearched. By 2:30, you've got over 200 people just restlessly waiting. And then, right at 3 p.m., Malcolm steps up to the wooden podium.
What happened next was the result of a complete cascade of security failures. It was a perfect storm for an assassination. There was already a heavily documented history of threats against him. His home had literally been firebombed just a week prior. Yet on this specific day, there are 0 NYPD officers stationed at the main entrance. The only 2 officers in the building were placed in a totally different room, far away from the stage. On top of that, Malcolm had explicitly told his own bodyguards to stay unarmed so they wouldn't alienate the audience. Because nobody was searching the attendees, 5 assassins, these were members of the Newark Mosque of the Nation of Islam, bypassed security entirely, hiding weapons right under their bulky winter coats.
So Malcolm begins speaking, right? And suddenly, a diversion erupts about 7 rows back. A guy starts shouting, "Get your hands out of my pockets!" The 2 men start tussling, and Malcolm's guards immediately scramble off the stage to go break up the fight. But it was a totally calculated distraction. It left Malcolm standing entirely alone on stage, completely unprotected, facing a man stepping out of the front row holding a sawed-off shotgun. Now, in the decades after his tragic murder, a very specific version of Malcolm was kind of crystallized into our history books. But that legendary icon was actually heavily shaped by outside forces. A huge chunk of Malcolm's post-mortem image was molded by his co-author, Alex Haley, in the autobiography of Malcolm X. Haley was a liberal Republican with his own integrationist agenda, and he basically crafted the autobiography to be a cautionary tale. He smoothed Malcolm out into this safe, almost secular saint. And in doing so, the reality of Malcolm's deeply radical political chapters, his controversial international alliances, and his shifting identities, they were all basically suppressed. So, to find out what actually happened, we're drawing directly from the Pulitzer-winning research of historian Manning Marble. His work points to the core thesis of our explainer today, which is this: Malcolm was not some static, unchanging figure. He was a master of reinvention. From a super early age, he learned how to put on new masks and personas. It was a necessary survival mechanism to protect his inner self from a world that was deeply hostile to him. And man, throughout his life, he assumed a staggering number of identities. He was born Malcolm Little. Later, he tried out the stage name Jack Carlton. Hustling on the streets of Boston and New York, he was known as Detroit Red. In a Massachusetts prison pacing his cell like a caged leopard, the guards literally called him Satan. And finally, after his pilgrimage to Mecca, he became El Hajj Malik El Shabazz. Every single one of these names was a distinct layer, a mask he carefully crafted to navigate and survive whatever environment he was thrown into.
Part 1. The Pan-African Foundation, Earl and Louise Little.
To really get why he needed all those masks, we have to look at the world he was born into, starting with his parents. His father, Earl, was this towering carpenter from Georgia, and his mother, Louise, was an educated woman from Grenada. They met in Montreal, and Malcolm was born into their fiercely militant household. They had dedicated their entire lives to the Pan-African teachings of Marcus Garvey and his Universal Negro Improvement Association. They weren't about just playing nice with the status quo. They preached a radical ideology, demanding total political independence, fierce cultural pride, and complete economic self-sufficiency for Black people all over the globe.
That Garveyite rallying cry right there, that was a constant soundtrack in young Malcolm's home. Earl and Louise were constantly moving their growing family across the Midwest, Nebraska, Wisconsin, Indiana, and finally Michigan, always preaching Black self-respect. But as you can imagine, that defiance came at a massive cost. Because Earl was an independent, skilled carpenter who totally refused to bow down to Jim Crow-era racial hierarchies, the family faced relentless, terrifying threats from the Ku Klux Klan and other white supremacist groups, literally everywhere they went.
Part 2. A Shattered Childhood. Let's walk through this timeline because it's essentially a devastating domino effect of childhood trauma. First, in 1929, an angry white mob actually sets fire to the Little family's home in Lansing, Michigan, burning it entirely to the ground while the local fire department just stands there and refuses to help. Just 2 years after that, his father, Earl, is found dead, crushed under a streetcar. The police ruled it an accident, but the black community and Malcolm's family firmly believed it was a brutal murder orchestrated by a vigilante group called the Black Legion. Finally, the relentless pressure of raising 8 kids in extreme poverty, all while under the oppressive, watchful eye of state welfare workers, breaks Louise's mental health. In 1939, she suffers a breakdown and is institutionalized for the next 24 years.
$1.75. Let that sink in for a second. That is the shockingly paltry amount per week, per child, that the state provided for childcare. I really want you to take away from this just how aggressively systemic poverty and deeply intrusive welfare workers completely dismantled this once proud Garveyite family. The kids were constantly hungry. Malcolm, just out of pure desperation, started stealing food from local stores, which eventually led to him being ripped away from his family and put into a foster home.
But despite all of that chaos, Malcolm was incredibly smart. At his new junior high school, he gets elected class president, and he's pulling in top grades. But then, a white English teacher delivers this unbelievably heartbreaking quote to him. In a single instant, his academic dreams were totally crushed. The realization that society had already put a hard ceiling on him, completely regardless of how smart he was, profoundly changed him. His grades just plummeted, he became super rebellious, and pretty soon he was expelled from school altogether.
Part 3. The Birth of Detroit Red. So, with his family scattered and his educational path slammed shut, a 15-year-old Malcolm desperately needs an escape. He boards a bus to go live with his half-sister Ella in Boston. But when he gets there and checks out the city's black metal class, he's not impressed at all. Echoing his late father's strict Garveyite teachings, he's totally disillusioned with this black bourgeoisie. To him, they were just complacent. Basically a big city version of the subservient workers back in Lansing who just thought they were high society. He knew right then and there he wanted a completely different path.
So instead of chasing that sort of middle-class respectability, Malcolm literally plunges headfirst into Boston's vibrant but dangerous underworld nightlife. He finds a mentor of sorts in a slightly older musician from his hometown named Shorty Jarvis. Shorty takes this wide-eyed country teenager under his wing, showing him the flashy style of the streets, the neon-lit jazz clubs, and teaching him a whole new set of rules for survival.
And man, Malcolm was a remarkably quick study. His rapid transformation from this rural outcast to a slick urban hustler is just staggering. He takes a job buffing shoes at the Roseland Ballroom, catering to actual jazz legends like Count Basie and Duke Ellington, all while just soaking up the rhythms of the street. Before long, he's not just shining shoes anymore. He's learning the economics of the illegal daily numbers racket. He's getting into petty thievery, and he's smoking marijuana. We're talking hustling 101.
And just like that, the mask of the hustler was fully forged. By the time he's 16, Malcolm Little is basically gone. In his place stood Detroit Red, a nickname he picked up because of his reddish hair and his Midwestern roots. This rebellious, hardened persona, it wasn't just some teenage phase. It was a highly calculated survival mechanism. It was a reinvention born directly from the ashes of a shattered childhood and a society that flat out refused to see him as an equal.
Which leaves us with a really fascinating, provocative question to end on today. How does a shattered, traumatized boy, hiding from the world behind the flashy mask of a teenage street hustler, eventually reinvent himself one more time to become Malcolm X, a global icon who fundamentally altered the course of history? It really makes you wonder how many other historical legends are hiding an entirely different reality right beneath their carefully crafted myths. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer. And remember to always keep questioning the history you think you know.